All right, go ahead and open up your IMDb workbook, and if you've been following along up to this point, you should see a view that looks something like this. Now, as we shift into pivot chart mode, I kind of want to start with a blank canvas and a clean starting point. So what I want to do is actually clear all of the content from this pivot table view. Now when I clear it, it will also clear things like calculated fields and items that we had added. So if you do want to preserve those, I'd recommend either duplicating this pivot tab or saving your workbook as a separate file, because once we do clear the content, there's no undo to bring it back. So I'm going to go into my pivot table analyze tools, clear all, and now I've got my clean canvas to work with, just a blank pivot table template that's tied to the exact same source data that we've been working with all along. So this will kind of serve as our starting point as we begin to explore pivot charts specifically. Now, one tip that I'll offer when it comes to working with pivot charts is to focus on your pivot table view first. Since the two are tied together, it's often easier and more intuitive to get your table into the right format first, and then simply insert a chart to add that visual layer. So in this case, let's start simple and practice inserting a basic column chart. And since column charts are a great tool for showing relative volume across categories or dimensions, I'd like to start by exploring the number of titles released broken down by genre. So I can pull number of titles into the values field and then drag genre and drop it in as my row labels. Now one thing you may have noticed is that our view has kind of shifted down all the way to row 9, and that's caused by adding and removing different filters. So if I go ahead and just delete the first 7 rows, if this bothers you, you can pull it back up. But again, it's caused by dragging filters in, which creates a new row, and then when you pull them out, that blank row is kind of preserved up there. So just a little bit of a side note, but if it does bother you, it's a very easy thing to adjust. So there we go. We've got sum of the number of titles broken down by genre. And a second tip that's important to keep in mind is that pivot charts work best with relatively simple views. So looking at 1 or maybe 2 metrics, no more than 1 or 2 dimensions. The idea really should be to focus on using pivot charts to tell one clear story at a time. So in this case, now that I have my simple view and my one clear story, which is the breakdown of titles by genre, I can go into my pivot table analyze tools and click pivot chart, which will launch the insert chart dialog box. And typically Excel will start you off with a suggested chart type, which may or may not be what you want. But in this case, a column chart or clustered column will work just fine. So press OK, and boom, there you go. Now that we have our chart in place, watch how it reacts as I change things like sorting and filtering options. In this case, Z to A versus A to Z. Why don't we go ahead and sort genres descending by the number of titles. And as we do that, you can see that the two are tied together. So now we get this nice trend from high to low in terms of number of titles by genre. And then we can do the same thing with filters. So we can apply a value filter, top 10 for instance, to only show the top 10 genres by titles released. And you may also notice that I have a row labels button right here in the chart itself. This is called a field button. And using these, I can apply the exact same filters. So for example, I can drill into this genre filter button. I can see the filters and sorting options that have already been applied through the table, and I can go in and just modify these settings. So let's change from top 10 to top 5 items, and as you can see, both the chart and the table update. So there you have it, basic pivot column chart.